at number 10, we have North Korean starvation rumors. None of us really know what's going on in North Korea. We would like to think that we have an idea, but it's all rumors. There are very few people who have been able to escape the struggles of that country, but most of the secrets are well hidden. And while their leader would like to boast like they have a strong economic standing within their walls, there are several stories that say otherwise. One of those stories has been of great famines in impoverished areas. This causes the people to chase down anything for food. Because much of the soil isn't fertile enough to grow crops, some people have had to turn to eating bugs or stray animals to stop from dying from starvation. There are even rumors that when times get really tough, people will go missing, and some people are turning to cannibalism just so they have something to eat.
In our number 9 spot today, we have Mauro Prosperi. Mauro Prosperi is an Italian police officer who got lost in the Sahara Desert in 1994 while doing the Marathon of the Sands in Morocco. This marathon is a 6-day-long endurance race in one of the most dry and barren places in the entire world. During the race, a sandstorm hit and caused Mauro to become disoriented, and he lost his way. One day after going missing, he found an abandoned Muslim shrine in Algeria, and he used it as shelter from the sun. He killed and ate bats to survive, and for hydration, he had to drink his own urine. He licked dew off of the rocks, and he sucked moisture out of the wet wipes he had with him. After failing to be seen and rescued by 2 different aircrafts that flew right over him, he figured he would never be found, and he tried to take his own life. The heat in the desert, however, is so dry that the wounds clotted, and he thankfully survived this attempt. For 9 days, he walked through the desert and ate insects and reptiles. Finally, he found a small group of nomadic people, and they took him to the nearest village. From there, he was flown to the hospital, where doctors said his liver had almost completely failed. Having traveled 180 miles in total, Prosperi lost 35 pounds in body weight, and it took years for him to fully recover. But despite all of this, he has remained an enthusiastic runner and even returned and completed the same race a few times. In our number 8 spot today, we have Peter Skylberg. In February of 2012, 2 snowmobilers made quite the discovery when they saw a car that was trapped in the snow. They began to dig this car out, and that is when they realized that this car had a man in the backseat, and he was alive. It isn't quite clear how or why, but 44-year-old Peter somehow got his car trapped underneath all of this snow, and this is where he spent 2 months before the snowmobilers were able to rescue him. 2 months in a trapped car. Peter told doctors that he survived without food by just eating snow and staying inside of his warm clothes and sleeping bag. The temperatures around the time of him being found were as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius, which had people wondering how he didn't freeze, and this is thanks to what people referred to as the igloo effect. The snowed-in car is probably exactly what shielded him from the elements, just enough to ensure that he didn't freeze. No one is quite sure exactly how he survived, but some suspect he may have gone into a sort of hibernation. Either way, because of the snow and his adequate water intake, 2 months is definitely getting close to as long as a person can go without food, so thankfully he was found when he was. In our number 7 spot today, we have Michael Benson. In 1992, as Michael Benson and Chris Duddy were in a helicopter over an active volcano in Hawaii, shooting some aerial footage for a movie, the helicopter crashed. It is said that the helicopter lost power so suddenly that they didn't even have time to radio for help. This led to the 2 men and the pilot Craig Hosking being stuck inside of the volcano, just missing a bubbling pool of lava. The pilot and Chris were able to get out of the volcano not too long after the crash, but the same couldn't be said for Michael. The volcano emits a ton of noxious gases, but luckily where the men ended up was in a part of the crater that enough fresh air could also reach. Michael didn't know that the other 2 men were already out of the volcano, and he was extremely worried that they had perished, all the while of course being worried about his own fate. He tried to pass the time and calm himself down by reciting the alphabet backwards. He prayed. When it rained, he cupped his hands to collect the drinking water, but none of this could distract him from the sudden small eruptions and bubbling lava below. After 2 days with no food or sleep had passed, Michael thought he was at his end, but rescue helicopter pilot Tom Hauptmann was able to see Michael through a small momentary break in the steam before the fog all took over again. They knew where he was, but they had to go in to save him with no visibility. Almost 2 hours after being spotted, Michael was able to make it into the safety net, where he was then lifted out of the volcano. He recalls a triumphant feeling as he left. In our number 6 spot today, we have Matthew Allen. Okay, when I was a kid, every time I was mad at my parents or brothers, I thought about getting a stick, tying a little handkerchief around it filled with my most precious belongings, and running away forever to live a life in the wild jungles of Saskatchewan. I thought about doing that, but never did, because I would quickly be reminded of how I would absolutely not be able to even and get down the block before turning right back around. Unfortunately, however, the same could not be said for Matthew Allen. In December of 2012, the teenager at the time, like most of us during our teenage years at some point, got tired of his parents' rules and restrictions on his life and decided to run away from home. But aside from how just running away is a terrible idea in general, the timing was also just all wrong. He ran away during a record-breaking heat wave, and after running away, the 18-year-old went missing for 9 weeks. By the time he was found by some hikers, he was lost in the Australian outback, disoriented, unable to stand, and he had lost half of his body weight. He was surviving solely on creek water. He was extremely lucky to have survived for as long as he did, and he really just made it. Thank goodness for whatever led those hikers there that day, because he was cutting it extremely close. In our number 5 spot today, we have Jose Salvador Alvarenga. On December 17th, 2012, Jose set out on a professional fishing trip with a young fisherman named Ezekiel Cordoba. They planned the trip to take around 30 hours, and they were setting out to hunt tuna, mahi-mahi, and sharks. Just a few short hours into their trip, however, things went awry when a storm struck that lasted 5 days, and it of course blew them way off course. Jose of course radioed into his boss to call for help, but unfortunately the radio had been totally disabled by the storm, as well as the rest of the boat's electronics, and the motor was also badly damaged. When the men didn't return, a search party was sent out, but it only lasted 2 days before being called off because they just assumed the men had already passed away. The 2 men survived by eating raw fish, turtles, and jellyfish, and they drank rainwater and turtle blood, but the weeks quickly turned to months and there was still no sign of rescue. This is when the young fisherman fell ill from the raw food diet and he sadly passed away. Jose was now on his own and he managed to survive another 9 months alone at sea until he finally spotted a small island. He abandoned the boat and swam all the way to shore. He had reached the Marshall Islands and he met a local couple who immediately alerted the authorities. He survived out there for 438 days, and it is estimated that he covered somewhere between 5,500 to 6,700 miles. In our number 4 spot today, we have Douglas Mawson. Douglas was another person who was called an explorer, and he was also a geologist. He is most well known perhaps for his face being on the paper $100 note in Australia, but part of the reason he landed that gig is due to this story. In December of 1912, Douglas, along with 2 other explorers, set off on an expedition meant to explore the interior of the Antarctic, but unfortunately, only pure tragedy ensued. First, one of the explorers, Belgrave Ninnis, fell into a crevasse along with most of the group's best dogs and a ton of their supplies. The other 2 now had to push on without most of their food and equipment in the unforgiving environment that they were in. The 2 fell ill with things like scurvy and they were struggling to get back to their camp, and they ended up surviving for a while by eating the dogs that remained with them, and then they just barely scraped by on the rest of their food portioned out with starvation rations. The other explorer, Xavier Mertz, ended up passing away from exhaustion, starvation, and people also assumed the possibility of toxicity from consuming the dog's liver. In the end, Doug battled the elements for about 30 days before he finally made it back to camp in February of 1913. But when he got there, he realized that he was frostbitten, skeletal, exhausted, and that he had also missed the ship that was retrieving the rest of the crew by just hours. To add a little more drama to this one, there are rumors that he may have kind of sabotaged Mertz's starvation rations that would have, quote, hastened his death so that he could consume his final companion, but that is all rumors and it has never been substantiated, so we'll just assume that that is untrue. In our number 3 spot today, we have Truman Duncan. In June of 2006, Truman, who was a switchman, headed into work for another day of working on the trains. During the workday, he ended up accidentally falling and landing in between moving railroad freight cars. This ended up leaving Truman trapped under the wheels, which not only cut off his legs, but also sliced through his pelvis bone. He somehow, absolutely miraculously, stayed alive, stayed conscious, and was able to pull out his phone and call 911. Some speculate that perhaps the weight of the car is what prevented him from bleeding out, but regardless of whatever it was, it truly is incredible. He ended up losing his legs, his pelvis, and a kidney, but the most important thing is that he didn't lose his life. No one is really exactly sure how he survived, but it definitely had to do something with Truman's ability to stay calm and call for help, even in a situation I couldn't even imagine being faced with. In our number 2 spot today, we have Mary Vincent. Mary Vincent's story starts out in September of 1978 when she was hitchhiking to her grandpa's house in California. She was on the side of the road with a group of other hitchhikers, which is exactly why it was weird when a blue van pulled up and the man inside claimed he could only take Mary with him. Huge red flag right there, which Mary definitely picked up on, but this being the 70s coupled with her young age, and the fact that she just wanted to get to her destination is what caused her to still accept the ride. As the drive went on, Mary ended up falling asleep, and when she awoke, she quickly realized the nightmare she was in, as she realized they were now in Nevada, not California. She began to panic, but the man driving assured her it was just an honest mistake. Yeah, I pick up random strangers all the time without knowing where I'm going and somehow end up in another state. Yeah, no worries, Mr. Weirdo. The next time they stopped, the man ended up attacking Mary. He then threw her out of the car and proceeded to cut her arms off with a hatchet. At this point, she was now unconscious, and he put her body, assuming she was going to or already had passed away, into a concrete pipe and down an embankment. After he left, Mary regained consciousness and realized that she could not just give up and stay there because no one would find her. She got up and climbed up to the road, all the while holding her arms up in order to slow the bleeding. She was able to flag down a car and was rushed to the hospital. She not only survived but testified against the man in court. Mary continues to live a happy, fulfilled life after surviving what many people would call the impossible. In our number 1 spot today, we have Alison Botha. Sometimes I hear a story that I truly cannot believe is real, and Mary's was definitely one of those, and Alison's story is also absolutely one of them. She is a woman unlike any other, and this survival story starts out in her home in South Africa in December of 1994. She was 27 years old at the time, and after a night out with friends, she drove back to her apartment, and when she parked her car, a man with a knife ended up forcing his way inside. The man forced her over into the other seat, and he began to drive her car with her inside to go and pick up some sort of accomplice. These two absolute monsters, who really don't even deserve to be named, took Alison to a deserted area on the outskirts of town and did some of the most violent and disgusting things I've ever heard that I absolutely cannot repeat here on YouTube, and then they just simply left her for dead. At this moment, Alison was still breathing, despite having been disemboweled, and I'm not even making this up, despite being nearly decapitated. And not only was she still alive after these injuries, but she also said, quote, "I realized my life was too valuable to let go of, and that gave me the courage to survive." This is when Alison not only wrote the names she knew her attackers by in the dirt, with "I love mom" below, just in case she didn't survive, but she also saw headlights in the distance, and she knew that this was her chance. She started to pull herself up, and this is when she realized how injured she really was. I kid you not, Alison held her intestines in with one of her hands and used her other hand to hold her head onto her body, and she made her way towards the headlights. Thankfully, a young veterinary student named Tian Ellard was on the road that night, and he saw Alison and stopped to help her. He used his vet knowledge to help keep her alive until emergency services arrived, and the doctor at the hospital where Alison was taken said, in reference to her injuries, that they were the most severe he's ever seen. Not only did Alison survive, but she also remembered so much about her attackers that she was able to lead them right to the police. The two are spending the rest of their lives in prison, while Alison uses her voice and her experience to empower and motivate others around the world. Alison is truly a remarkable human being that I am absolutely in awe of.
So we're starting off with James Scott. Back in 1991, James went hiking with his friends in Nepal, but he got lost and separated from his group. Unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of survival tools with him. He only had some layers of clothes, a sleeping bag, books, and a first aid kit. He also had 2 chocolate bars, but he ate them within the first 2 days of being lost. So in total, he spent 43 days trapped in a snowstorm eating nothing but snow. His body was extremely dehydrated and weak. Fortunately, he was found by a search party, and he lived to write a book about his near-death experience.
Coming in at number 9, we have the canoe trip. Back in August of this year, a mother and her child went on a little canoe trip in northern Saskatchewan, and they certainly weren't prepared for what was going to happen to them. That afternoon, the current was so strong that they were swept away and ended up at an unoccupied island. The wind was so strong that no matter what they did, they couldn't gain control of their canoe. They were stuck on the island for just a day before they were rescued. In our 8th spot, we have HELP. Back in 2016, 3 men were deserted on a remote island near Micronesia after their boat capsized in the South Pacific island. The 3 men originally had plans for a short sailing trip, but the weather became brutal and tipped over their boat. And it was at night when this happened, so they swam 2 miles in the dark until they reached land. From there, they used palm leaves to spell out the word help on the island's sand. Thankfully, the men were only stranded for 3 days before a US Navy plane spotted their fire and then their sign and came to their rescue. In our 7th spot, we have Philip Ashton. In June of 1722, fisherman Philip Ashton joined a crew who planned to sail the waters of Nova Scotia. But while at sea, the crew was captured by pirates, and Philip was held as their captive. For 9 months, Philip was stuck being the pirates' prisoner. But all of that changed in March of 1723. That's when they docked on shore and Philip made a run for it. The pirates searched for him briefly before giving up and getting back on the boat. Philip was then left stranded on the island all alone with no tools or food. But he managed to make a little shelter and ate fruit and turtle eggs to survive. 16 months later, a British ship rescued Philip, and he lived to tell the tale, and even wrote a book about it. Coming in at number 6, we have the Friends. Back in 2012, friends Jesse Brillin and Brian and Dave Martinuke were out boating when the strong winds and rough waters caused their boat to capsize. They managed to pull the inflatable raft from the boat and spent 15 hours drifting hopelessly. Eventually, they drifted close to land, where they were stranded for 10 days. They used driftwood to build a shelter and ate sea urchins, seaweed, and clam beds for food. On the 10th day, a sailboat spotted the trio's pile of garbage on shore before seeing the men and rescuing them. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the SOS. A couple of months ago in August, 3 sailors got stranded on an island after attempting to make a 23 nautical mile journey. However, they ended up getting lost and their boat ran out of fuel. They were stranded on this island for 3 days before being rescued by the Australian and US authorities. During these 3 days, they managed to make a small shelter and a large SOS sign out of debris. On the 3rd day, this sign was spotted by a passing aircraft, and that was the reason why they were found. Moving on at number 4, we have the river monsters. This next man got found by sheer accident. He's actually quite lucky. So in 2016, a fisherman was out sailing when he decided to leave his boat to go to try and find better oysters. But on his journey back, he got sunstroke and couldn't go any further. As a result, he had to spend the night on the beach. The next morning, he tried to travel back some more, but again, the heat and sun were too much for him. By then, his boat was gone and he was stuck on the island. But lucky for him, a TV series called River Monster arrived on the island as they were using it as their filming location. That's when they came across the fisherman, who ran out of the cave to the crew naked, flailing his arms all about. The crew literally saved his life. Now, this man is so lucky because the crew weren't even supposed to film at this island in the first place. They were planning on using a different island, but changed locations last minute due to choppy waters. Little did they know that by doing this would save a man's life. In our 3rd spot, we have Ada Blackjack. In 1921, Ada Blackjack struggled to take care of her son who was suffering from tuberculosis. In order to make more money for her son's treatments, Ada joined a team of explorers as a cook and seamstress. But the journey didn't go as planned. Quickly, they were out of food and had to go hunt to obtain more. Ada was left to care for a crewman, Lorne Knight, who was suffering from scurvy, while the others went to go look for more food. They never returned for Ada or Lorne. From there, she had to learn how to survive. She would trap and kill wild animals for her and Lorne. Sadly, Lorne passed away, but Ada managed to survive for 2 years alone. On August 19th, 1923, Ada was rescued by one of the men that left her there in the first place. Like, the nerve that dude had to come back after all those years. I would have been pissed. Like, yes, I'm here, I'm still alive, thank you for leaving me. In our 2nd spot, we have the Castaways. Now, this story is a bit different than the rest of the ones on the list. In this case, the two wanted to be left on a deserted island. So back in 1980, a British writer put an ad in Time Out magazine saying that he wanted a female to live with him on a deserted island. I don't know about you, but I would be a little sketched out by that ad. But one lady, Lucy Irvine, was intrigued by it, and so the two set out to Toon Island. Now, she was only 24 years old, but the British writer was 49. Now, he didn't plan this through enough, because there wasn't enough fresh water to sustain them and hardly any vegetation on this island. The two survived on the island for about a year when they were saved by some islanders. If it wasn't for them, they wouldn't have survived because they were running out of the necessities. Story goes that Lucy was the one keeping them both alive. But the other dude, on the other hand, had given up faith a number of times. He didn't think they were gonna make it. And in our number one spot, we have Alexander Selkirk. Alexander Selkirk was a Scottish man who is famous for surviving on an island for 4 years. So in October of 1704, Selkirk was a part of a crew sailing around Cape Horn. But the crew started to become very sick. Many were dying of disease and their food supply was diminishing. Plus the food that they did have was all infested with worms. And the ship was in rough shape. So he told the captain they should just abandon the ship and wait for help. The captain was not too fond of this idea. And so Alexander got off the ship and waited around on a deserted island thinking that another ship would be along shortly. Well, shortly was 4 years and 4 months later. All he was left with was some clothing, a musket, some tools, a Bible, and tobacco. To survive, he found fresh water, ate goats and seals and plums, and he even tamed a wild cat to keep him company and to keep the vermin away from him while he slept. Starting off this countdown, we have the desert. Back in 2011, 84-year-old Henry Morello was driving to his home outside of Phoenix, Arizona, when he took a wrong turn. He attempted to make a U-turn and ended up crashing in a ditch. He was left there stranded with a dead cell phone. For 5 days, Henry waited, hoping someone would come to his rescue. During the cold nights, he would huddle under his floor mats. But it got to the point where he needed something to eat and drink. So he started to drink his windshield washer fluid. Thankfully, a couple of days later, a pair of hikers saw his car and came to his rescue. Now, just because Henry survived off of windshield wiper fluid does not mean you should go drink it. No, doctors say he's lucky because it could have killed him.
In our number 9 spot today, we have Marco Lavoie. Marco was a person from Quebec who was headed up to the northern area of the province for a canoe trip. During this trip on the Nottoway River, he had set up camp, of course, as one does, but unfortunately nature had some other plans for him. A bear ended up coming and raiding his camp, and while doing so, ate all of his food and destroyed his boat, which left Marco with very few supplies and his dog. Marco survived out in the wilderness for an unbelievable 90 days before he was rescued, and when he was found, he was completely out of it and was delirious and was barely saying any words at all, and he wasn't with his dog anymore. After a bit of time in the hospital while healing from his injuries, he finally revealed the desperate measures he had to go to in order to survive, and that involved using his companion as food. Of course, this came under immediate scrutiny, and he received a lot of hate for the decision he made. Of course, however, we can all be upset about what happened and acknowledge how tragic the situation was, but none of us can really judge unless we've been in the same sort of dire situation. After the entire situation, survival experts began to come to the defense of Marco, saying that you have to do what you can to survive, and after a certain time, the decisions sometimes aren't even conscious ones, and it's simply just survival instincts kicking in. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Miracle of the Andes. I talked about this one on another video recently because this is perhaps one of the most famous survival stories of all time, and it starts in October of 1972 when members of the Old Christians rugby team, along with members of their families and their friends, were flying to a match in Chile. The pilot made a mistake and began to descend while in the Andes, and this led to the plane striking a mountain, which sheared both of its wings off, and the plane then crashed into a remote area that has been nicknamed the Valley of Tears. The initial crash took the lives of 12 people, which left 33 survivors. A search party was initiated, but after 8 days it was called off because the conditions on the mountains were considered near unsurvivable, and because the remnants of the white aircraft would be basically invisible in the snow. In order to survive, the remaining people who were stuck here had to resort to the most extreme survival methods in order to sustain themselves, which involved using those who had passed away for sustenance. In the coming weeks, 6 more people passed, and then an avalanche took the lives of 8 more as if they hadn't already gone through enough. It is now December. Remember, this flight happened in October, and 2 of the remaining survivors set out to find help and miraculously found 3 Chilean men 4 days later. By December 23rd, all 16 of the remaining survivors were rescued after being stranded for over 2 months with no food, no gear, literally nothing. If going through all of that wasn't enough, the public tried to criticize how these people went about surviving this absolutely horrifying situation, but they rightfully defended themselves and their actions. In our number 7 spot today, we have Aron Ralston. This is another one of those stories that has gone down in history as one of the most famous survival stories ever because it's truly unbelievable, but also thanks to the blockbuster movie that was made about the entire ordeal, which then brought the story to people who hadn't yet heard of it. In April of 2003, 27-year-old Aron Ralston was climbing in Utah's Blue John Canyon when he found himself in an unfortunate situation where an 800-pound boulder fell on him. This caused his right hand to be crushed, which then left him trapped. Of course, Aron tried everything he could to free himself, which included using his multi-tool he had on him to try and chip away at the rock, as well as trying to fashion some kind of a pulley with his climbing rope in an attempt to pull the rock away from him. After multiple failed attempts and a total of 6 days being stranded, Aron realized that his only way out would likely be to amputate his own crushed hand. When describing what that was like, Aron told National Geographic News that it was, quote, 100 times worse than any pain I've felt before. Yeah, Aron, I truly cannot even imagine. Thankfully, this was enough to free Aron, and he was able to get the medical attention he needed, and of course, survived. Aron even ended up going back to climbing after his recovery with help thanks to a special kind of prosthetic hand that has a built-in climbing pick. While we're on the topic, just a quick shout out to all those engineers and medical professionals who dedicate their lives to building prosthetic limbs for people. It's such a cool and important job, and I don't feel like we recognize them enough. So, thanks! In our number 6 spot today, we have Ernest Shackleton. Ernest is a man who braved the harsh conditions in the South Pole once, so by 1914 he was ready to do it again. He set out with a group of 28 men, and they all had the intention to make it all the way across the continent to then arrive at a ship that would be waiting for them on the other side. Well, things took a bad turn almost immediately as they were on their journey to the Antarctic when they all became trapped in ice as their ship, the Endurance, fell apart. From here they were trapped, their supplies slowly began to dwindle, and this led to the men getting aboard life rafts to then float for 14 days through the icy Antarctic seas to an island. Unfortunately, once here, this wasn't the end, as the men then had to take another long journey all the way to the nearest inhabited island, which was South Georgia Island, and this took them about 1,000 miles from their original point. Imagine having to float for 1,000 miles hoping you make it to where you want to go. Despite everything the men went through on this journey, all 28 of them survived the entire ordeal, but sadly the same could not be said for some of their furry companions. Unfortunately, the men found themselves in situations similar to Marco that we discussed earlier. To make matters even worse, the ship that was waiting for the men on the other side of the Antarctic, the one that of course never ended up actually seeing the men at all, the Ross Sea Party, ended up experiencing 3 deaths. In our number 5 spot today, we have Steve Callahan. Steve Callahan was a man who had just finished his successful solo journey across the Atlantic, and this insane story starts out when he was on his way back. Steve was sailing in his 6.5-meter sloop in January of 1981 when a storm struck, but this didn't concern Steve as much as the hole that was left in his boat's hull from either a whale or a shark, as that was most definitely taking over his attention. The boat began to sink, and this is when Steve was quick thinking and repeatedly dove back into the sinking ship to grab as much survival gear as possible. Steve was now left on a 6-foot circular raft adrift in the Atlantic. At this point, he was about 800 miles west of the Canary Islands, but as time went on, he was only drifting further and further away. While lost at sea, Steve fished with a spear gun and made drinkable water using a solar still. On day 14 of being adrift, he signaled to a passing ship, but it didn't stop for him. After a month of being at sea, he was far out from the shipping lanes, and by day 50, he was really struggling to live. He was covered in sores from the salt water, he was extremely dehydrated, and there was now a hole in his raft that was getting difficult to keep patched. After 76 days had passed, Steve was exhausted, and he was so thin he had lost 1/3 of his body weight. Birds began circling his raft to try and scavenge the leftover fish guts that Steve had tossed back into the waters, and while that is really gross, This is actually what led to his rescue. The swirling birds led to some fishermen spotting Steve on his raft, and then they came to the rescue. Steve had lasted over 2 months lost at sea and managed to keep himself alive the whole time. In our number 4 spot today, we have Joe Simpson. Two best buddies, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, were doing their thing, climbing throughout the Peruvian Andes when a terrible accident occurred that left Joe with a broken leg and heel. This is obviously a really big issue when climbing mountains, and it's also important to note that the climb the men were doing was a particularly difficult one, and throughout their experience, there were some very severe weather conditions that they were also facing. Simon tried to help Joe and tried to help them both get back to safety, and to do this, they tied their 2 ropes together to then lower Joe down the different mountain stages, all the while doing this in weather that was continually worsening. Simon lowered Joe 3,000 feet using this method, and they felt for a while like things were going to be okay, but just as they were getting relatively close to the safety of the glacier, Joe went over an unseen cliff edge while being lowered, which meant that Joe was hanging completely free with only the rope that Simon was holding keeping him from falling. Literally, his life was in Simon's hands at this moment. Joe couldn't get his weight off of the rope, and there was no way that Simon could possibly lower him any further. The 2 were stuck here for what was later estimated to be over an hour and a half, and the longer they stayed here, the more Simon was being pulled by Joe from his unbelayed stance. Simon was 150 feet above Joe, and who knows how far above the glacier they were aiming for. There was unfortunately only one thing they could do in order to keep Simon from falling off the side of the mountain, and that was to cut the rope. In doing so, Joe fell about 50 feet to the entrance of a crevasse, where he then fell again to a ledge within the crevasse. After cutting the rope, Simon dug himself a snow hole in the slope behind his stance, which he then spent the night in. The following day, he completed his descent to the glacier, and since he wasn't able to find Joe, he just assumed his friend had lost his life, and he returned all the way to base camp. Little did he know, however, that Joe did not lose his life, and instead he was able to climb and crawl out of the crevasse, and after 4 days, he himself reached the base camp. Both of the men survived, and of course people criticized Simon for cutting the rope in the first place, but Joe understood the situation for what it was and quickly came to his defense, saying that had the roles been reversed, he would have done the same thing. There really was no other option in this scenario, and in the end, thankfully, it all worked out. In our number 3 spot today, we have Julianne Kopka. Miss Julianne has like a 2-for-1 when it comes to survival stories. Her story starts out on Christmas Eve 1971 when she was just a teenager and was on Lanza Flight 508. The plane was struck by lightning, which is an actual nightmare situation, and this led to the plane starting to basically disintegrate midair. If you've seen any horror movie that takes place at high altitudes where the plane gets broken, you know what happens next. In what felt like the blink of an eye for Julianne, she found herself still strapped to her seat, just 2 miles above the Peruvian rainforest. She was injured, of course, full of bruises, had a broken collarbone, but she was alive. And in fact, she was the only person who had been on the flight that was still alive. But now, she was in the wilderness, alone, and all she had with her was a bit of candy for food. Julianne found a small stream which she began to wade in downstream. The insects in the jungle were eating her alive, and sorry, this is so gross, but maggots had infected her arm. Julianne ended up coming across a sort of encampment where she found a few supplies. She was so smart and was able to give herself a little bit of first aid, which included pouring gasoline on the infected arm, which then led to all the disgusting little creatures leaving it. Just a few hours later, a few lumber workers found her, gave her more first aid treatment, and took her to an area that was more populated, where she was then airlifted for medical treatment. In 2000, her story was told through the documentary titled Wings of Hope, which was directed by Werner Herzog, who took particular interest in the story because it is obviously incredible, but he too had booked a seat on that flight, and he would have been on it if it wasn't for a last-minute change of plans. In our number 2 spot today, we have Ada Blackjack. Ada was a woman from Alaska, and she was a part of the indigenous Inupiat people. She was hired by some Canadians for an expedition to the Wrangel Islands, which in current times is Russian territory, but back when this story took place in 1921, the expedition was intended to claim the islands in the name of Canada. Ada was hired to be the cook and the seamstress for the expedition, and was told that she would be one of many indigenous peoples on the trip, but this was a lie. There were 5 people left on the island, including Ada, and the other 4 people were European, Canadians, and Americans. They first got to the island on September 16th, 1921, but quite quickly they realized their rations were running low. 3 of the crew members left Ada alone with the other member of the crew who was ill, while the 3 went off in search of resources, and this was the last time any of them were seen. Ada was left to care for this ailing member who was sure to treat her horribly while she essentially kept him alive. Soon the ill member passed away and Ada was now completely alone. Ada survived alone on this island for 2 years after they initially arrived. 2 years! This is unbelievable for many reasons, including the imminent risk of a polar bear attack at any point. She ended up being rescued after all this time alone, and she used the little bit of money she had from selling furs that she collected over the 2 years to get the help needed to cure her son's tuberculosis. Ada was undoubtedly an incredible person with an unbelievable story, but it's also very important to note that not only did Ada receive criticism for not keeping that one crewmate alive, but she also spent the rest of her life in poverty despite the multiple books that were written about her and the entire ordeal. I think that really speaks for itself. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Apollo 13 crew. Many of us have heard of this story before because it is truly unbelievable, but also because of the Tom Hanks classic. And no, I am not talking about Toy Story 2. This space crew took flight on April 11th, 1970 and had the intention of landing on the moon, but because of an oxygen tank explosion on board that nearly killed them all, these astronauts were forced to go the furthest out in space any living human has ever been in order to save their lives. They used the lunar module as a lifeboat and they stretched their rations that were intended to be a day and a half worth of food for 2 people into food that lasted for 4 days among 3 people. They faced hardships some of us can't even imagine, while those on the ground worked tirelessly to figure out how to get them home safely. Had to make an orbital correction that took them far from the moon and about 248,655 miles from Earth before they could slingshot back around towards Earth. The lunar module was their safe space while still out in space, but re-entry to Earth is a totally different ballgame. This meant they had to get back into the damaged command module for this part before they were able to land back on Earth, and they did so safely. Everyone involved in this entire mission, from the crew in space to those on the ground working to save them, did incredible work, and it really is a story that will never be forgotten. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Angela Hernandez. This story starts off in July of 2018 when a woman named Angela was driving down Highway 1 near Big Sur on her way to Southern California. While driving, a small animal ran out into the middle of the road, and of course for a multitude of reasons, Angela didn't want to hit it, so she swerved. Unfortunately, this led to Angela shooting right off the edge of the cliff in her SUV, which then led to a tumble down about 200 feet to a grim area of the rocky beach. I call it a grim area because it's a place where no one visits. Of course, this entire scenario is exceptionally traumatic and severe, and it left Angela with very serious injuries. After the crash, she was suffering from a brain hemorrhage, fractured ribs, a broken collarbone, ruptured blood vessels in both of her eyes, and a collapsed lung. But despite all of these injuries, the most important thing was that she didn't die, and that she wasn't about to let her fate be sealed right there. She was initially unconscious after the crash, but when she came to, she saw water lapping over her knees. She had a multi-tool in her car that she was able to use to break out the window so she could crawl out, where she then swam to the beach and passed out again. Later, when she woke up, she realized she had no shoes and the severity of her injuries started to set in, but despite all of this, she got up and started walking. She used a hose from her car to help collect water from the dripping moss along the shore, and every time a car passed by, she tried to get their attention, but unfortunately because of where she was, no one could see her or hear her. 7 days after the crash, some hikers were out and about searching the beach for fishing spots when they came across the wreck of the Jeep. Thankfully, these people didn't stop there and continued searching for the person who belonged to the Jeep. That is when they found Angela sleeping on some rocks. They gave her water and called for help, and finally, after 7 days, she was able to be rescued from this absolute nightmare situation.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Johnson family. It's hard enough being stuck in quarantine with your family. I can't imagine how it would be stuck on a deserted island with them. In the early 90s, the Johnson family headed out sailing on their family boat. However, the family of 4 encountered some rough waters, which resulted in their boat tipping over. Unable to save their small boat, they watched it sink right before their eyes as they bobbed up and down in the freezing cold waters. The family ended up making it to a nearby island and survived there for nearly 40 days. They would collect rain droplets for drinking and caught turtles and fish as their food source. Thankfully, they were rescued by a local fisher who saw them on the island. That's definitely one method of family bonding.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Hugh Glass. I'm not gonna lie, when I first saw this name pop up as I was doing research for this video, I thought it was one of those prank names, but turns out it 100% is not, and I just suck. Anyway, Hugh Glass was an American fur trapper, trader, and hunter, as well as an explorer, which, given the time frame of his life, 1783 to 1833, we can all imagine exactly what that would have looked like if you catch my drift. If you've seen The Man in the Wilderness or The Revenant, you'll be kind of familiar with this story. So basically, Hugh and some other men were out on a fur trading adventure, and at some point in the journey, they regrouped at Fort Kiowa before setting out to Yellowstone River. But as they were searching for animals to hunt, Hugh accidentally stumbled upon and subsequently disturbed a grizzly bear who was with her 2 cubs, which we all know is a bad scenario. The bear charged at him, bit him, slashed him up, you know, exactly what you think happens when someone is being mauled by a bear. Despite this attack, Hugh, with the help of the other men, was able to fend off this bear, but he was left with some serious injuries. The group carried him for a while, but they realized that doing this was slowing them down, and at this point they were convinced that he was going to die from his injuries. This is when the leader asked for 2 volunteers to stay behind with him until he passed away, and then to bury him, which 2 people stepped up to do. Then, because of what the 2 volunteers would later claim to be a sort of ambush attack, the 2 men grabbed Hugh's rifle and knife and basically all of his equipment and ran out of there and went to catch up with the rest of the group, where they then falsely told them that Hugh had died. He was able to regain consciousness, but now he found himself abandoned, and he had festering wounds, a broken leg, and deep cuts on his back that exposed his bare ribs. He set the bones in his leg, he allowed the maggots in his wound to continue eating the dead flesh so as to try and prevent gangrene, which is disgusting, and then he began crawling the 200-some-mile journey back to Fort Kiowa. He crawled toward the Cheyenne River, where he made himself a sort of float device, and then he floated downstream towards the fort. Not only did he survive a bear attack, but then he survived after being abandoned for 6 weeks, and he actually made it back alive.
Next on the list, we have Leendert Hassenbosch, a Dutch sailor who was kicked off the boat he was stationed at and left to die. He was exiled for sodomy, and he was left on an island alone in the year 1725. He had a diary which was found later, but his body was never found. It would seem that he might have lasted for a year and a half on the island, but struggled to find food. He most likely had to drink turtle blood and his own urine to stay alive. Some think that he might have made it off the island with a passing ship and never told anyone who he was, since the crew would have left him there if they found out that he performed sodomy. It was different back then. People were a lot more close-minded.
David Blaine comes into this list at number 9. Yes, the famous David Blaine. In September of 2003, David Blaine started an endurance stunt in which he was sealed inside of a transparent glass that was suspended 30 feet in the air next to the River Thames in London. This stunt lasted 44 days, and it involved David Blaine drinking 4.5 liters of water per day and not eating a single thing. A lot of people believe this stunt was just an illusion, so they couldn't constantly taunt him and make his experience a living nightmare. They actually flew a hamburger on a remote-controlled helicopter around his box. They would throw food at his box, and someone actually tried to cut the cable that supplied water to his box. Like, did you guys actually want to try to kill him? Could you go to jail for attempted murder?
In our 9th spot, we have Poon Lim. Poon Lim was a Chinese sailor on a British merchant vessel during World War II. The ship was on its way to New York when it was attacked by a German U-boat. The ship was completely destroyed, but Poon managed to escape, and he managed to survive 133 days alone in the South Atlantic. It's pretty unbelievable. Poon survived by catching and eating live birds. He would drink their blood to quench his thirst. He also used his minimal resources to catch sharks sharks. He would catch them, then drink the blood from the shark's liver to survive. In the end, he was rescued by some fishermen. After all he had been through for 133 days, he only lost 20 pounds. So clearly, he got enough calories.
Next on the list, we have Witold Glinski. When you're on the run from the law during World War II, you better never look back, especially when you're Polish and the law is the Soviet Union. He was imprisoned in a gulag, but he was clever enough to come up with a plan with some of the people that were locked away in there. They figured out how to escape and they were successful, but that was just where the story starts. They were now in the middle of a frozen wasteland in Siberia, and if anyone found them, they would be executed. It seemed like the military or the cold would kill them, but they weren't about to quit, so they started walking and they managed to hike all the way through Siberia and make it to the Gobi Desert. They crossed that, and then they made it to the Himalayas and they crossed those as well to make it into India, which at the time was controlled by the British, so they were now safe. The journey was both dangerous and difficult. They had to suck moss just so they wouldn't die from dehydration. They would catch food here and there, but for most of the venture they had to go days without food.
Our stomachs are rumbling in at number 8, and we're talking about Brendan Hughes. He was involved in a hunger strike in which they protested for the rights to be treated as prisoners of war rather than criminals. Brendan Hughes and 6 other inmates refused food for 53 days before Hughes ordered the hunger strike to end because their demands were not being met. Brendan Hughes died at the age of 59 years old due to an illness associated with his failure to fully recover from the hunger strike.
And at number 8, we have the Grand Canyon Adventure. On December 22nd, 2016, a woman named Karen Klein, her husband Eric Klein, and their son were on a road trip to the Grand Canyon. However, their GPS system was faulty and kept leading them onto closed roads. Eventually, while following the GPS, the car ended up in a muddy ditch. There was no cell service, so Karen decided to go out for help. But while out, a huge snowstorm hit. She found shelter under a spruce tree. Apparently, she kept herself awake by replaying Star Trek episodes in her head. That's just a little fun fact I thought I'd throw in there. Star Trek literally kept her alive. As Karen continued on, she eventually pulled a groin muscle and lost a shoe. She was cold and suffering from hallucinations. She ended up eating pine needles and drinking her urine to survive. 36 hours later, on Christmas Eve, rangers found Karen.
Next on the list, we have Otakichi. Imagine being 14 and stranded in the ocean. This was the wild story of Otakichi. He was a Japanese teenager working on a boat in the 1800s. It was a transport vessel that would mainly work with rice. Well, one day things didn't go as planned and the ship got blown off course and the sails were destroyed. Now these guys had to find some way to live, so they just started eating the rice. How long do you think you could live off of rice? Well, for Otakichi, it was 4 months. Several of the other crewmates died, but this dude kept living. Eventually, they washed up on the shore of the Washington Olympic Peninsula, and you would think that they would be saying, "Thank God we are saved." Well, that was before they were taken into slavery by a local tribe. Yeah, things just kept getting worse. They were eventually freed when they were passed on to the Hudson Bay Company.
Barry Horn starves himself in at number 7. He was an animal rights activist who gained international attention when he participated in a 68-day hunger strike in an effort to pursue the British government to review their laws on animal testing. The hunger strike caused him to suffer from kidney damage, and he died of liver failure 3 years later. And now at number 6, we have Brother Yoon. He was arrested numerous times and was imprisoned 3 times for promoting gospel in communist China. During his first imprisonment, he said that God wanted him to fast without food and water until he could see his family again. His fast lasted 74 days and he became severely malnourished and came close to dying.
We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the USS Indianapolis. On July 30th, 1945, the USS Indianapolis was struck by 2 torpedoes. Within 12 minutes, the boat sunk completely. Now, they didn't have enough lifeboats for all the men on board, so most strapped on a life jacket and then just jumped into the waters. Of the 900 that survived the initial sinking, only 316 made it out of the waters alive. Those that survived shared their story. So according to them, for days they were just floating around at sea. Some were killed by hungry sharks. Others passed away from dehydration. In fact, men were so desperate that they started drinking the salt water, but this caused them to become delirious. Got so bad that the men started to attack and harm each other. Others would see things in the water. They would yell that they saw food in the water. They would then swim down and never return. To this day, it's said to be one of the worst sea disasters in US naval history.
Next on the list we have Debbie Kiley. Debbie went out on a fishing trip with some friends that went pretty sour pretty fast. The boat ended up flipping and the crew tried to get a life raft together before the people went down, but they only got it half inflated, so the 5 people left had to hold onto this dinghy and all of them but Debbie and one other man would die. People became so thirsty that they drank seawater, which caused them to hallucinate from dehydration and drift off into the water. Debbie survived and wrote a couple of books about her experience. Next on the list we have the Alexanders. Oh, we have more than one family that watched their boat tip over and fill with water. This time we got the Alexanders. For this story we got to zoom over to the 80s and meet up with a family that wasn't planning on living out at sea but wanted to go for a nice day of sailing. Well, it turns out that the weather wasn't on their side and they ended up flipping their boat. This thing sank faster than the Titanic on fast forward, and now both parents and their 2 kids were floating out in the ocean. The waters were freezing and they only had one option. They had to swim, and eventually they made it to an island. The struggle now was that there wasn't anyone else on the island. The family was now forced to survive without any food, so they went hunting and fishing. Luckily it rained quite a bit while they were on the island, so they had something to drink, but both parents admitted afterwards that they thought they were going to have to watch the other person die, and if it came to that, they thought they might even have to eat them.
Mohammed Al-Kik takes us into number 5. This Palestinian reporter was accused of belonging to an Islamic terror group and he was arrested. 4 days within being taken into custody, he refused to eat because he was detained without knowing the charges or evidence that they had against him. Within 3 months of his hunger strike, his body looked like a skeleton. He was in excruciating pain, his speech was slurred, and his vision was fading. After 92 straight days of not eating, prison guards tied him to his bed, forcibly examined him, and they put an IV line in his arm against his will. Buddha Boy climbs up this list, and at number 4, a teenage boy in south-central Nepal meditated for 10 months and he didn't consume food or water for the entire time. He gained international attention, and even the Discovery Channel flew a film crew to Nepal to determine if it was even possible for a human to survive without food or water for this long. A lot of people believe that this was an elaborate hoax, so the film crew set up a camera for 96 straight hours where they observed his every move. They determined that there was no hidden water pipes or food sources, people sneaking him food. I'm still skeptical, but what do you guys think? Because, I almost died within the first hour of no food.
Moving on to number 4, we have the Princess of Wales shipwreck. In 1820, the Princess of Wales ship set out on a seal hunting voyage, but it ended badly when the ship crashed in March of 1821 at the Crozet Islands. Now, there was not a lot of food on the island to keep the crew alive, so they started killing sea elephants. So according to one of the crewmen, they would wash in the sea elephant's blood. Then they would eat their brains raw. And apparently it tasted sweet like sugar. Yeah, that's what they said. Some managed to survive this accident by strictly eating brains. Moving on to number 3, we have Mauro Prosperi. In 1994, 39-year-old Mauro Prosperi took place in a 6-day marathon through the Sahara Desert. Every 10 kilometers, there was a refreshment point for the runners to refuel themselves. But on the 4th day, a huge sandstorm struck. Mauro was covered by the sand. It was fine though. He freed himself and kept going once the storm was over. Only problem was, he no longer knew which way to go. He ended up traveling 4 hours in the wrong direction. He was running out of supplies when he realized that he was lost. At one point, he found a marabout and stayed there for quite some time. There, he would capture and drink the blood of bats and also drink his own urine to survive. He also did the same to snakes and lizards. He would catch them, drink their blood, and then eat them raw. That is hardcore. Finally, after several days, he was found and rescued.
Next on the list we have Alexander Selkirk. How long do you think you could last if you were stranded? I don't know how long I would go for. I would think that I would be tough enough to keep myself alive for a little while, but I don't know if I could last as long as this guy. This is the story of Alexander Selkirk. He was a Scottish sailor who was kicked off his ship and left on an island. This was back in the 1700s. So the people on board were sure that they just left him to die. die. Well, it turns out they were wrong. The dude spent 4 years out there and never wavered. Starvation started to get him, but then he became resourceful and was able to find shellfish to live off of. The sea was providing him with a ton of food, but then sea lions came to the shore and pushed him into the jungle. Now, to make sure he didn't starve, he had to chase down wild goats and milk them. At night, he would be attacked by rats, but he solved the problem by finding wild cats that would hunt around him if he fed them to keep them close. Eventually, he was saved. I wonder if he still ever thought he would be saved after spending 4 years on an island alone.
Alright, next up, number 3 is a science experiment's patient. Back in 1965, a man who was morbidly obese went to the Department of Medicine and told them that he wanted to lose weight by starving himself and living off his body fat. He told the hospital that he was going to do this regardless what doctors say, so they might as well monitor him and study him during his dangerous fast. He didn't eat any food, but hospital staff gave him yeast for the first 10 months and a multivitamin every day. He continued this fast for a total of 382 days, and his weight dropped from 456 pounds to 180 pounds. However, this is extremely dangerous and he could have easily died.
Next on the list we have Yossi Ginsburg. Formerly in the Israeli army, Yossi wanted to do something amazing with his life. He was 21 years old and he wanted to trek into the Amazon rainforest and find places that no one had ever been before. He planned on doing this alone, but while traveling he met 3 other men. 2 of the men were fellow adventurers and the other was a geologist who knew the land and told them where they could find some small villages within the rainforest. They eventually made it to the Amazon rainforest and stopped at a small village to stock up on supplies and then headed on. After a few days of traveling, it was clear that they were lost and eventually the truth came out. The geologist, who apparently knew the land, he was a con man who had tricked them into exploring the jungle with him because he was trying to find a hidden stash of gold to steal from the Amazon people. Well, now none of them knew their way out and the group parted ways. Yossi and another member of the group jumped on a raft that they made themselves and started to head down a river. The raft broke apart and the 2 men were separated when Yossi went over a waterfall. For the next 3 weeks, Yossi wandered around the rainforest being eaten by bugs and doing whatever he could to survive. He would scavenge for dead animals to eat and steal eggs from nests. Eventually, he was sure that he was going to die when he couldn't walk from the amount of pain in his limbs. Then he was rescued by the very friend that was separated from him on the raft. This guy came back with a boat to find him. The other 2, no one knows what happened to them.
Moving on to number 2, we have the Expedition. Back in 1845, Sir John Franklin led 2 ships filled with 129 men to explore the Canadian Arctic in search of the Northwest Passage. However, along the way, the ships ended up getting stuck in ice, and they all faced a chilling death. But thanks to the ice, the bodies of the crewmen were preserved. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers recovered the remains of the crew on King William Island, and they found some pretty terrifying things. It was thought that the crew resorted to cannibalism for their last couple of days. They had food aboard the ship, but many were sick from scurvy and tuberculosis, hypothermia, and pneumonia, which made them disoriented and wild. The crew were found with cut marks all over their body, indicating that their flesh was cut off the bone and eaten. On other men, their bones had been cracked open and the bone marrow was feasted on.
Things get even more extreme, and at number 2, with the woman who lived without food or water for over 56, not days, not weeks, not months, we're talking years. Guri Bala was teased about her weight ever since she was a young girl. After constant ridicule and torment, she decided to stop eating altogether. She practiced religious prayers and taught herself breathing exercises and practiced this technique constantly and has apparently never eaten since. Guri hasn't eaten for 56 years, but again, I found this very, extremely hard to believe. And finally, at the number 1 spot, because how do you beat that? Well, there's someone that beat that record. We have Prahlad Jani, who hasn't eaten in 70 years. In 2010, he was being held in isolation at a hospital where he was closely examined and monitored. He's being referred to as a breatharian who believes that it is possible through meditation that they can reach a level of consciousness where they don't need to fuel their body with food. They can live off of the air and sunlight. I mean, is this real life right now? I don't think so. I'm sure he sneaks in a Snicker bars or something, once in a while when no one's looking. No one can go that long without food. But then again, I've never tried this form of meditation, so who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is possible, because you know what? Anything is possible.